Every flight begins and ends here. A strip of asphalt scorched by jet engines and marred with rubber. But not all runways are created equal. One of the world's most notorious is Runway 35L at Congonhas Airport in Brazil.
It could surprise you at any moment.
In July 2007, TAM Airlines Flight 3054 becomes its latest victim.
Accelerate. Accelerate. It can. It can.
The runway claims 199 lives. It would be carefully scrutinized, its history reviewed. Investigators desperately need to know why Runway 35L is so dangerous
35L.
before more lives are lost.
Mayday, Mayday.
Heavy rains pound Brazil's largest city. Sao Paulo sees this kind of deluge regularly during the winter rains. The downpour snarls traffic to and from Congonhas Airport. 800 kilometers away, TAM Airlines Flight 3054 is en route from the southern Brazilian city of Porto Alegre. The Airbus A320 is headed for Sao Paulo 90 minutes away. For the 181 passengers on board, it's a routine domestic flight. But there's been an unexpected development for Captain Henrique Stefanini di Sacco. He and his first officer, Kleiber Lima, have just learned that the heavy rain has temporarily shut down Runway 35L, the main runway of their destination.
Did they say when it would reopen?
No.
Let's prepare an alternate just in case. Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like due to the weather, we may not be able to land at Congonhas as planned. I will keep you advised as I get more information.
Congonhas Airport is one of the busiest in the world. Planes take off and land here every 90 seconds, carrying a steady stream of people and cargo into the country's economic hub. But Congonhas is also notorious among pilots. The airport lies in the heart of the city, crowded on all sides by apartment buildings, offices, and roadways. Runway 35L is less than 2,000 meters long, short for large jets. Even worse, it's built on a hilltop with a sharp drop-off on all sides.
The risk the airport poses, due to its construction, due to its geography, it does not allow for simple mistakes.
Não permitiria erros simples, falhas simples.
Captain Carlos Camacho is the flight safety director of the Brazilian Pilots Union.
Quando se aproxima da pista,
As you approach the runway, your adrenaline is really pumping. For us pilots, it's like landing on an aircraft carrier.
Nós enxergamos como porta-aviões.
It makes Congonhas one of the most treacherous airports in the world. In fact, a Pantanal Airlines commuter plane spun out of control while landing just the day before. And a few months ago, disaster was narrowly averted when a Boeing 737 came skidding to a stop, just inches before the steep embankment at the end of runway 35L.
When pilots begin landing at Congonhas, they're more worried than when operating at any other national airport.
Flight 3054 is at cruising altitude south of Sao Paulo when the crew gets news that runway 35L is back in operation.
3054 35L is the active runway.
There's no need to divert.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I have some good news for you. The runway at Congonhas has reopened. We'll arrive as scheduled shortly before 7 p.m.
The relief of the passengers is not shared by the pilot. Stefanini has an additional challenge on this flight.
Remember, we only have one reverse, sir.
Yes. Only the left.
He will have to land at one of the world's most challenging airports, with less than the usual amount of stopping power. One of the Airbus's 2 thrust reversers isn't working. The devices are designed to slow the aircraft on landing by reversing engine thrust.
If I was the pilot that day, I would be extremely concerned knowing that one of my reversers wasn't functioning.
TAM 3054, 35L, clear to land.
Stefanini will be landing on the infamous runway 35L.
The runway is wet and it's slippery. The wind is 330 at 8 knots.
The crew was informed of poor braking conditions on the runway.
The Airbus is on final approach. Even though the autopilot could get the plane to the runway, the captain decides to take over the controls himself.
Land green, manual flight.
He wants to bring the plane in as close to the runway threshold as possible. He needs every inch of runway he can get.
35L, 35L.
The concern was that after touching down, the pilots needed to be sure that they would be able to stop their plane before the end of the runway.
The passengers only know that they'll soon be landing. Now they are only 300 feet above the city. The Airbus is lined up with the center of the runway.
Middle.
The runway conditions.
200, 200. 100, 100.
1 duck now. Okay.
The plane's wheels will touch the Congonhas tarmac in seconds.
20. Retard.
As the plane touches down, their worries about landing are only just beginning.
Captain Stefanini applies reverse thrust to the A320's only working reverser.
The pilot would have to activate the reverser on the engine that had a working reverser as fast as possible to initiate deceleration.
But the plane is not slowing down.
Reverse number 1 only.
At this rate, it will use up the entire 1,945 meters of runway in less than 30 seconds.
Decelerate.
It can't!
The pilots operated the foot brakes with the pedals, pressing on them for a long time.
Look at this.
Now,
Look at this.
the aircraft mysteriously pulls to the left.
Turn! Turn!
It's almost as if it has a mind of its own.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Flight 3054 has slammed into a TAM Airlines building and an adjacent gas station. Nearly 200 firefighters descend on the scene. They face a raging fuel fire, burning at almost 1,000 degrees Celsius. The devastation horrifies Dr. Douglas Ferrari.
The explosion spread fire throughout the entire area. There was a fire in the gas station, killing the people who were filling up their tanks, burning the whole structure, turning it unrecognizable.
He had hoped to treat survivors, but now he fears there might not be any.
We had 4 cars on fire. In one of these cars, I saw a mother with her child, dead.
The entire plane is engulfed in flames. There's little hope for anyone inside. But now there is a new danger. Huge quantities of fuel in the storage tanks beneath the gas station could blow up at any moment.
The aircraft broke its wings on impact and spilled fuel throughout the entire area. There was a risk of the gas station exploding.
Rescuers hope they can save people in the TAM Airlines building. But with the fire raging out of control, they will have to act fast.
We tried to rescue the people from inside the building. I was anxious to help them.
Dr. Ferrari makes a grim find inside the TAM Airlines offices.
The airplane wing blocked the way. It prevented people from escaping. I was behind the firefighter accompanying me while he moved bodies to the sidewalk. It was a horrible feeling.
But they do locate some office workers in another part of the building and rush them to safety.
On the right side of the building, where there was no obstruction, there was time for people to get out. About 10 or 20 people made it.
No one in the aircraft has survived. 199 people are dead, including a dozen people in the gas station and the TAM building. It's the worst aviation accident in South American history.
The black boxes will not last long in the heat!
Lieutenant Colonel Fernando Camargo is an accident investigator with CENIPA, the country's aviation safety agency.
In modern aircraft, the recorders are the core of any investigation. So when we arrived at the crash site and we saw that strong fire, we got really concerned about the integrity of the data.
He knows the intense heat could already be damaging the plane's data and voice recorders. Valuable evidence that could help explain the crash may already be lost. Colonel Camargo and his team know that just the day before, another plane slid off runway 35L.
We knew that we would have to run a complete investigation on the runway.
If a rain-slicked runway caused this crash, disaster could strike again soon. The pressure is on to figure out exactly what happened to Flight 3054.
I knew that there was a video from the surveillance system.
That's the time of the accident. That must be it.
The airport surveillance system captured the doomed Airbus speeding down the runway.
This video could solve a lot of issues.
Let's see it again, please.
But the crash was outside the range of the cameras.
Can we look at this from a different angle?
Even without the crash on tape, the video could hold important clues.
Do you have tape of other A320s landing? Okay, go ahead and play it now.
We compared these time frames from one aircraft to another.
Nine seconds.
A regular landing, the aircraft would take something about 9 seconds to pass over this camera.
Okay, now the crash plane, please.
And the accident aircraft took 3 seconds.
3 seconds?
That puzzled us a little bit.
Why was the crash plane going 3 times faster than the regular A320 landing?
Four hours after the accident, firefighters are still battling the intense blaze.
The fire was a strong fire with a lot of fuel to keep it burning.
Camargo is desperate to gain access to the tail section, which contains the 2 black boxes.
They concentrated the fight in the rear of the aircraft.
Finally, firefighters beat back the flames enough to get at the recorders. But it may be too late.
They can be submitted to fire till a certain temperature. After that, there's no guarantee that data will be preserved.
The recorders will be sent to Washington to be examined at the National Transportation Safety Board. Now, investigators can focus on the infamous Runway 35L. They examine the surface for clues that might explain why Flight 3054 went so badly out of control.
We walked through the runway, searching for evidence, marks of the aircraft, the point where it veered off the runway.
It's still wet!
The water is pooling, creating puddles. That shouldn't happen on a modern runway.
When this water gets in contact with the landing gear, the tires, it can generate what we call hydroplaning. And this is a problem because a pilot will have little or no control of his aircraft.
Camargo and his team wonder why water is pooling on the runway. They study files from the government agency that runs Congonhas Airport. They learned that Runway 35L had been completely resurfaced just 1 month before the accident.
In
2007, the runway at Congonhas underwent repairs. It had been offering a very low level of traction. There were many reports of skids.
For years, pilots have been complaining about the slippery conditions.
They knew that the pavement needed to be reconstructed because the surface allowed the water to accumulate.
35L, 35L.
The runway had been resurfaced. That should have solved the water problem. It reopened just weeks before the crash. The new surface seemed to be a major improvement.
The airport operated for about a month in dry weather with no problems.
But then, 3 days before the crash, heavy rains began.
And with the rain, all the problems that were supposed to be solved came back.
On the night of the accident, the biggest problem was still the water. Aircraft were still reporting difficulties braking.
Runway is wet and it's slippery.
In theory, there was no more depressions on the runway to accumulate water. So what could cause water to accumulate?
He discovers that the repair work lacked a critical safety feature.
Proving to be done at a later date. No wonder it was wet.
Special grooves that carry away rainwater. Without them, rain would collect in puddles.
The repairs still lacked the necessary upgrade. It was very difficult to interrupt the operation of the main runway in order to install the grooves.
Evidence is mounting that a compromised surface on runway 35L played a key role in Brazil's worst airline accident. Colonel Camargo is concerned that Brazil's notorious rains may bring more runway disasters.
Soon after the accident, we recommended the suspension of the operations of regular aircraft in rainy conditions.
The airport authority complies, shutting down runway 35L until answers are found. But the main runway at one of the world's busiest airports can't stay closed for long. They must find out what caused this accident as soon as possible. Their focus turns to the A320's thrust reversers. The plane's maintenance records reveal why only one of them was working. 4 days before the crash, mechanics deactivated the right engine's thrust reverser for routine maintenance.
Check E3 found.
But the aircraft had then flown without incident for 4 days.
Action required.
Not only had the plane landed repeatedly with one thrust reverser, it had even landed safely on runway 35L.
This plane landed on the same runway. On the same runway that day with the same problems, had only one thrust reverser. Just one thrust reverser. No issues whatsoever.
So why had this landing gone so wrong? Colonel Fernando Camargo travels to Washington, D.C. Technicians at the National Transportation Safety Board will help him try to recover data stored in Flight 3054's badly burned flight recorders. First, they look for a temperature-sensitive chip that could provide a clue as to how bad the heat damage might be.
There is an indicator that turns the color if it was exposed to a temperature above that one that it was manufactured to support.
Even though the boxes are designed to survive a fierce fire of up to 1,000 degrees Celsius, the chip's appearance is worrying news.
These boards were submitted to a fire that exceeded its limitation.
They test the circuit board to see if any of the memory survived. Without the data, the investigation into Flight 3054 would be effectively crippled. Colonel Camargo may never know why 199 people died at Brazil's busiest airport. But the circuit board test provides some hope.
Okay, we got something.
Fortunately, everything works okay. We could recover 100% of the data.
Here we go.
The information paints a picture of the plane's performance.
The speed is fine.
In the critical seconds before the crash.
It came down fine. Brakes were engaged. The brakes were engaged.
The data confirms that the foot brakes were working properly and that the A320 did not skid or slide.
Here.
Then Camargo discovers that the plane's two engines were inexplicably operating against each other.
Engine 1.
The plane's left engine was in reverse to help slow the aircraft down. But the right engine, the one with a disabled thrust reverser,
it's powering up.
Was doing the opposite.
For takeoff. It's supposed to be idling.
Instead of winding down, it was accelerating to climb power.
Accelerate.
It can.
Accelerate.
It can.
With one engine at full power, the pilots didn't have a chance to stop their aircraft in time.
This aircraft was braking.
Oh my God! This.
But it would take around 1 more kilometer for it to stop.
The lopsided thrust pushed the plane to the left.
The right engine really was increasing thrust. There was no means available for the pilot to avoid the aircraft to veer off to the left.
Could be this.
So engine 2 was thrusting when it should have been idling. That would explain the veer off to the left, right? So what does this mean?
Now Colonel Camargo needs to figure out why the right engine was at full power when it should have been in reverse.
At that time, we could establish roughly 2 main lines of investigation. One, mechanical failure. And the other one, pilot error.
Colonel Camargo brings in human factors investigators Lieutenant Colonel Marcia Farja and First Lieutenant Vanessa Diaz.
Pilot is Enrique Stefanini Di Sacco, age 53, from Sao Paulo, 13,654 flight hours.
The pilot, who was in command, was a very experienced pilot. He knew the aircraft very well.
His first officer was Aguiar Kleber Lima, age 54, from Puerto Velo, 14,760 flight hours.
He had enough training to do a good job, including in an emergency situation.
Their job is to determine if the crew somehow made an error that could have caused one engine to stay at full power.
Machines are straightforward because they work in predictable ways. Humans are infinitely more complex in the way they think and act. It's much harder to analyze their behavior in an accident.
But I can't believe that this pilot would make that kind of mistake. Okay.
The human factors team must now conduct a psychological study of the crew to understand how they might have committed a fatal misstep.
We attempted to reconstruct the individual history of each crew member and their experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I have some good news for you.
And tried to create a picture that could help us explain what happened in the cockpit.
Colonel Camargo still believes a mechanical failure is more likely. He now turns his attention to the complicated mechanics that link the thrust levers to the engines. He must determine if a failure there led to the mysterious power surge.
We began studying the thrust system, each and every component of the system, from the lever to the engine.
We've been through it. We know it's not the FADEC.
There's nothing wrong with the engines. That leaves only one component that could have caused the problem. The mechanism that links the throttles to the engines, a device called an artificial feel unit, or AFU. Investigators wonder if that device failed, leaving the engines at full power even though the pilots set the lever to idle. But such a failure is highly unlikely.
It's really a remote possibility. 400 billion hours of flight for us to have one occurrence of that.
Still, he needs to rule out the AFU as a possible cause of the crash. But he's not sure the unit can even be found amongst the wreckage.
Computers, all the avionics, everything was gone.
Luckily, one of the few pieces to have survived the fire is the piece investigators now need, the AFU. It's sent to a specialized laboratory that can scan the metal for microscopic markings.
Well, look.
It got melted in such a way that you can work with it so we could check something.
The 3D scanner allows them to look for nicks or scratches that would indicate the unit failed.
I'm looking for any unusual marks in this area.
If we could find out any mark, any evidence of the position of this gear, we could go after the lever and find out the real position of the thrust lever.
But they can find no evidence that the AFU malfunctioned.
Okay, pack it up, let's go home.
We found nothing. No mark, no evidence.
Colonel Camargo concludes mechanical failure was not to blame for the improper power setting on the right engine. He has to assume that for some reason, the crew left the right engine lever at full power after the Airbus landed. Back in Sao Paulo, the human factors team turns to the cockpit voice recorder, or CVR.
I have some good news for you. The runway at Congonhas.
They need to understand the pilot's state of mind as they approach Sao Paulo the night of the crash.
The CVR enables us to get an idea of the interaction between crew members.
They learn that Captain Stefanini was quite concerned about the runway conditions.
Ask him about the rain. The runway conditions. Is the runway slippery?
TAM on final approach. 2 miles away. Could you confirm conditions?
It's wet and it's slippery, 3054.
Wet and slippery.
The pilot is already tense, and then he finds out that runway conditions are worse than usual, slippery and rainy. The tension can affect the pilot's perception, his concentration.
35L, 35L.
It now appears that Stefanini's anxiety about 35L, and not the runway itself, was the main cause of this crash. Camargo now focuses on the crew's actions.
I think it's ready, sir.
Thank you.
He needs to understand how the power levers were handled before the crash. Using data from the flight recorder, investigators focus first on the landing just prior to the one at Congonhas.
We discovered that the same pilot, the captain, was the one operating the aircraft in the previous land and in Congonhas.
First, how did they land in Porto Alegre?
Okay. Both levers full forward during approach.
They learned that during the previous landing in Porto Alegre, Captain Stefanini pulled back both thrust levers. exactly the right procedure for landing with only one reverser.
And now, both levers to reverse.
At the time of the accident, the correct procedure was for the pilot to take both throttles to idle and both throttles to reverse, as if you had no problem with the reversers.
They've established that Captain Stefanini carried out the correct procedure for landing with one thrust reverser on the day of the crash.
No reverser number 2. Auto brakes on, and speed is dropping.
It puzzled me because of the fact that a captain knew the procedure, he performed the correct procedure hours before in the previous landing.
So what did he do differently 2.5 hours later in Sao Paulo?
Okay.
Okay, now Congonhas.
Left lever to idle.
The data shows that Captain Stefanini's handling of the thrust levers
Then reverse.
was very different on his landing in Sao Paulo.
20.
Instead of throttling back both levers, he only put the left engine in idle, leaving the right one at full power. Then, once the aircraft had touched down, he activated only the left reverser, again leaving the right engine at full.
That is quite different. I don't get it.
How could a guy that knew the aircraft, that knew the correct procedure, that executed a correct procedure, how could he do something different?
It doesn't seem to make sense.
We could really use your help on this.
Until Camargo enlists the help of another pilot. It's only then that he discovers an important detail that could explain what the captain did. It turns out there was an older, outdated procedure for landing an A320 with a single thrust reverser.
Could you demonstrate it for me, please?
It starts out the same, but then there's an important difference.
The former procedure was taking both levers to idle and then just the lever corresponding to the engine with the reverser operating normally, that would be taken to reverse position.
But that is not what Captain Stefanini did. He left the right engine at full power instead of bringing it to idle. If he was attempting the old procedure, he got it wrong. Investigators learned that Captain Stefanini would not have been the first pilot to make that mistake. There had been several accidents around the world. The cause was identical. Pilots mishandling the procedure for landing with a disabled reverser, inadvertently leaving one thrust lever at full power.
That old procedure led pilots to error.
Airbus finally modified the procedure to reduce the risk of precisely that error.
The manufacturer changed the procedure and determined that both levers would come down together to the idle position, and then, right after touching the ground, both would come down to the reverser position.
Captain Stefanini was familiar with both the old and the new procedure for landing with a disabled reverser. It now seems on Flight 3054 he may have tried to use the old one. The question for investigators is why? Investigators still can't understand why the crew of Flight 3054 left an engine at full power after touching down.
Did they get it wrong?
But after interviewing other pilots, they do understand why using the older procedure would have made sense that rainy day at Congonhas. It would bring the plane to a stop much more quickly than the new one.
That could explain why the captain would go for the former procedure that he knew that was more efficient than the current one.
Investigators theorize that in reaction to deteriorating conditions at Congonhas,
Wet runway, one reverser. I'm going to buy us some runway and use the old procedure.
he was trying to ensure that he'd have as much distance as possible to stop on the notorious Runway 35L. But he made a costly error.
Under those circumstances...
Remember, we only have one reverser. We have one reverser, manual flight. Wet, slippery. One reverser, manual flight.
It is completely understandable that he had tried a former procedure and under such a pressure made a mistake.
Lieutenant Vanessa Diaz recreates the final moments of the flight in a simulator.
Okay, engine 1 to idle, engine 2 stays at climb.
She notices that in a dark cockpit, it would have been difficult to see the position of the thrust levers.
20. Retard.
Engine 1 to reverse, don't touch number 2. Brakes.
No simulador, nós temos como programar todas.
In the simulator, we were able to program in every known factor.
Nublado, chovendo.
The chronology of events, whether it was cloudy or raining, the wet surface, the slippery surface, position of the levers.
Dos manetes estarem na posição.
We also went off the runway and had an accident in the simulator.
E tivemos acidente no simulador.
Lieutenant Diaz believes she now understands why TAM Airlines Flight 3054 ended in tragedy. Captain Stefanini had done everything he could to ensure the A320 would touch down on runway 35L with as much room ahead of him as possible.
Land green, manual flight.
But the prospect of landing on the treacherous runway had so unnerved him that he bungled a simple procedure.
It's possible that tension might block a crucial motor response. It can affect the pilot's ability to react.
There was no alarm to warn them that one engine was speeding up while the other was in reverse. First Officer Lima tried to figure out what was going wrong.
Decelerate!
But in a dark cockpit,
It can't!
overwhelmed by a landing going badly, he didn't notice the abnormal thrust lever settings.
Decelerate! Decelerate!
Pilots were unable to understand what was happening to their aircraft.
Conseguindo perceber o que estava acontecendo na aeronave.
Look at this!
A runway with a dangerous reputation so unnerved a crew that they made a mistake that ended up killing 199 people.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Go!
Since the crash of Flight 3054, the runways at Congonhas have been grooved and are regularly inspected. New rules are in place dictating wet weather landing procedures.
In rainy weather, you need to have all of your reversers operating.
But despite these efforts to improve safety at Congonhas, many pilots doubt it's any better.
Congonhas is not safer today. It continues to be a dangerous airport. Only a total ban on operations in wet or rainy conditions would improve the safety of this airport.
What's clear is that even today, 35L is a runway that cannot shake its deadly reputation.
35L, 35L.
A scene of devastation in a remote region of Venezuela confirms the fate of a missing passenger jet. West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 has mysteriously dropped from the sky while flying at over 30,000 feet.
It took off from Panama. It's a Colombian operator. There was 160 French citizens on board.
This is the biggest accident that has ever occurred in Venezuelan territory.
Investigators hope the crew's desperate last words
West 708, do you have a problem on board?
will help them pinpoint the cause of the crash.
Tell them we've had a flame out on both engines.
But instead, the mystery deepens.
It's a stall, Captain. It's a stall.
The pilots can't agree on why the plane is falling. Now it's up to investigators to figure it out.
Mayday, Mayday.
At Panama's Tocumen International Airport, West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 begins boarding 2 hours behind schedule. It's well past midnight. The 152 passengers on this charter flight are returning home to Martinique. They've been visiting the Panama Canal. Captain Omar Ospina has just flown in with his crew from Colombia. As he's behind schedule, he must turn the plane around quickly. But there are more unexpected delays. First Officer David Munoz informs the captain that the flight is overbooked. Even the jump seat in the cockpit is filled.
Let me deal with it.
Alejo, I need you on board to do the announcements in Spanish and English.
Yes, sir.
Angela and Luisa can stay behind.
I'll let them know.
2 of the flight attendants will stay in Panama because there's not enough room on board.
Sir, we just got the final load sheet.
Checking the weight of the aircraft
Take off from runway 21 left, sir. 3,050 meters.
and the length of the runway, Captain Ospina calculates that he can safely get airborne. Their flight path will take them through some heavy weather, something crews are accustomed to during hurricane season.
Okay, we're ready for takeoff. Request pushback clearance.
Ground, West Caribbean Airways.
708, request pushback clearance, gate 28.
West Caribbean 708.
Cleared for pushback, gate 28. Proceed to runway 21 left. West Caribbean 708, runway 21 left, cleared for takeoff.
The V1. Rotate.
At 1 in the morning, Flight 708 begins the journey to Martinique.
They took off from Panama Airport to Congonhas Airport with a heavy load for a long flight for that aircraft.
The flight should take 3 hours.
They climb up to 31,000 feet, their initial assigned flight level. They have filed a flight plan with a final cruise level of 330, 33,000 feet.
The crew is flying an MD-80. The plane is easily recognizable by its 2 rear-mounted engines.
The MD-82 aircraft is a very good aircraft. It's a model that was derived from the DC-9. They made it longer, more fuel efficient, and more modern instrumentation and avionics.
Anti-ice on, please.
As altitude increases and temperature drops, they activate the plane's anti-ice system. Half an hour into the flight, while cruising at 31,000 feet, the weather ahead is turning nasty. A low-intensity hurricane moving in from the Atlantic has been whipping up winds across the region.
Request deviation left. Barranquilla, West 708. Request deviation to the left to avoid formation.
West Caribbean 708, cleared to deviate left.
In the kind of weather they were flying, it's common for pilots to deviate from their initial route to avoid this bad weather.
It should get better soon.
"40 minutes into the flight, the plane has burned through thousands of pounds of fuel, allowing it to fly higher.
In order to reduce weight, they had to climb to 31,000 feet, wait until the weight goes down, and then do a step climb up to 33,000 feet.
Let's do 330. 330. Barranquilla, West 708, request level 330.
708, cleared to level 330.
The captain now begins the climb to their scheduled altitude of 33,000 feet.
Turn off engine anti-icing. I can't accelerate.
The captain notices that the engines don't seem to be responding.
I'll go to the bathroom.
The crew isn't overly concerned. Almost a third of the way to Martinique, West Caribbean Flight 708 enters Venezuelan airspace.
Is there cake and coffee for everybody? Or are we expected to share?
As the storm intensifies, First Officer Munoz worries about icing.
Did I turn it on, Captain, or what? Do we have ice? Put them on.
Soon the turbulence gets worse.
Man, there's a lot of nasty weather. Put the fasten seatbelt sign on. Please, stay in your seat. I'm dimming the lights so the passengers don't stand up. Should we go down to level 310? Do it. Maiquetía, whiskey.
The Maiquetía air traffic control station in Venezuela isn't equipped with radar.
Request descend to level 310.
The controller depends on pilots to tell him where they are.
310.
Captain Ospina turns off the autopilot.
Give me 310.
And the plane starts heading back down to 31,000 feet. The turbulence is getting even heavier. And then suddenly the stick shaker goes off. It's the most serious warning that a crew can get. The captain's control column starts to vibrate, warning him the plane is flying dangerously slowly. At close to 31,000 feet, the plane suddenly drops.
It's a storm, Captain. Be It's a stall!
The plane is falling fast. The crew has only seconds to figure out why.
What's 70L? Level down to level 240.
Descending to 240. Do you have a problem on board?
Affirmative. Tell them we've had a flame out on both engines. We've had a flame out on both engines.
Confirm?
We've had a flame out on both engines.
Roger. Confirm radial and distance from Punto Cabello, if possible.
The controller needs to know where they are.
Negative! We are 14,000 feet! We're above 4,000! And going down! The plane is uncontrollable! Keep your heads down! Stay down! Keep your heads down!
Confirm people on board, intention, and distance from that main, if it's possible.
152 people on board and the plane is uncontrollable!
In just 30 seconds, the plane falls 9,000 feet.
I understand. 152 people on board.
Affirmative!
Acknowledge. Confirm at what level you are crossing at this time. Whiskey, Charlie.
Whiskey, Charlie, Whiskey, 708.
Confirm position if possible.
Whiskey, Charlie, Whiskey, 708. Confirm position if possible.
While flying almost 10 kilometers above the Earth, West Caribbean 708 mysteriously drops from the sky.
If possible.
Air traffic control in Venezuela doesn't know its location, nor if anyone has survived. The morning after West Caribbean Flight 708 goes missing, Venezuelan villagers report that a plane has crashed on a remote farm. Colonel Lourdes Ramos is the lead air crash investigator for the Venezuelan government. She has never handled a crash this big. She's shocked by what she sees. All 160 people on board, most of them French citizens from Martinique, have died.
Fue muy impresionante para nosotros porque era nuestro primer accidente.
It was a real shock for us because it was our first really big accident, and it had the highest number of deaths for any crash in Venezuela. We felt a lot of pressure because of that.
The scope of the investigation is daunting. Lourdes Ramos knows the plane that has crashed is one of the safest planes in the world. There are more than 3,000 such planes flying every day.
Investigating a crash where an aircraft so popular as the MD-80 is a great responsibility because of the effects they could have on the rest of the fleet.
The Colombian, Venezuelan, and French press from Martinique all descend on the site demanding answers. The plane has crashed in a lawless area next to the Colombian border. Kidnappings are common. The Venezuelan army informs investigators that it can only protect them during daylight hours.
We don't have a lot of time. Let's get everything documented.
Ciertamente, el equipo no estábamos incluyendo.
Certainly our team, including myself, wasn't prepared for the emergency we faced.
El accidente complejo y muy difícil poder.
This accident was complex, and it was very difficult to quickly figure out what had happened.
De lo que había sucedido.
After the victims have been removed, the investigators' first goal is to determine how much of the plane landed intact at the crash site. If it's all there, they can rule out a mid-air breakup.
Pudimos observar que estaban los 4 puntos de la aeronave, la cola.
We could observe the 4 corners of the aircraft, the tail, a part of the cockpit, and some remains of the wings.
Esto nos dio idea.
And this suggested that there were no explosions or a collision that produced the accident.
No hubo explosiones o algún acto que produjera ese accidente.
Investigators question the Maiquetía air traffic controller.
Told me that they had a flameout on both their engines. Do you have a problem on board?
Tell them we've had flameout on both engines.
Cuando recibimos la información del Centro de Control de Maiquetía,
when we learned that the crew had reported a flameout in both engines, we immediately focused on the function of the airplane's engines.
Se fue al funcionamiento de los motores de la aeronave.
Yeah, I'm just getting up to speed now.
Joe Sidor is a senior investigator at the NTSB in Washington, specializing in foreign assignments.
As soon as we're notified of an accident, we contact the manufacturer of both the airframe and the engine. Given the initial information of a dual-engine flameout, this caused us to start getting as much information about the engines as possible.
No sign of fire inside the engine.
Laura Lease had her hands full with this accident. It was a remote location, there was 4 countries involved, and she didn't have a big staff.
Let's see what we can find out about the weather they flew through.
Colonel Ramos knows that severe storms can kill a plane's jet engines. In 1977, a DC-9 with similarly mounted rear engines experienced a flameout while flying through a thunderstorm. Both engines were disabled. The plane fell 17,000 feet, slammed to the ground, and erupted in flames. Investigators suspect that the engines of Flight 708 may have flamed out either from heavy rain entering them or due to turbulent winds.
One way to think of an engine flameout is when you have a pilot light go out on your furnace at home. The engine is working properly with combustion going on internally, and then the flame stops and the engine quits.
If both engines flamed out, it would explain why the plane fell from the sky in one piece. But Colonel Ramos knows that her best chance of finding out exactly what happened to the engines lies with the plane's 2 black boxes. They could hold critical flight and voice data. But retrieving that data gets complicated by political concerns.
The other difficulty with this investigation was the international aspect. This was a Colombia operator that took off from Panama, was overflying Venezuela, and crashed on their soil. So from the Venezuelan standpoint, they had very little connection with the actual flight or passengers on the aircraft.
The Venezuelan government, deeply mistrustful of the United States, has the final say on who will examine the black boxes.
Since this is a United States manufactured aircraft, we offered our facility to them to download both the FDR and CVR. But they requested that they be downloaded at the French facility of the BEA, our counterparts in Paris.
The black boxes are sent to France for expert analysis.
The French aviation authorities participated in the accident investigation because all the passengers were French citizens that lived in Martinique.
In the meantime, investigators pursue another possible cause of engine failure: contaminated fuel. They track down the fuel truck that filled the plane in Panama.
Fue importante examinar el combustible.
It was important to test the fuel because it was a possible cause for why the engines had failed.
Habían fallado los motores. Esa era una posible causa.
El análisis del combustible por búsqueda de contaminación.
We asked the Panamanian authorities to test the fuel for contaminants, but the results they obtained were negative.
Fueron negativos los resultados.
Hi. Hope I can be some help.
Joe Sidor arrives from Washington with 2 engine experts.
Once we arrived on scene, that was one of the first things that we wanted to look at was the engines. So my engine investigator and the Pratt & Whitney investigator went to each engine and examined them thoroughly.
What they find is surprising.
Both engines exhibited indications of high-speed rotation at impact. That is to say that the evidence indicated that both engines were operating at a very high power.
The investigators give the engines a clean bill of health.
When
we obtained the analyst results for the engines, we realized that they work perfectly.
trabajaron perfectamente.
Do you have a problem on board?
Affirmative. Tell them we've had a flameout on both engines.
We've had a flameout on both engines.
Sure looks like those blades are turning when the plane hit the ground.
And that the flameout reported by the crew never happened.
Flameout nunca ocurrió.
The main suspect in the crash of one of the most popular planes on Earth is ruled out. Investigators need another lead.
It made us want to get that FDR and CVR data as quickly as possible.
The team is now counting on the plane's 2 black boxes to shed light on the cause of the crash. They travel to France, where one of the boxes has been opened. When they listen to the plane's cockpit voice recorder, investigators are surprised by what they hear.
It's a stall, it's a stall.
Luego de escucharla,
After listening to the cockpit voice recordings, we realized that the plane had entered a stall.
había entrado en pérdida.
How did this plane stall at over 30,000 feet with 2 working engines?
To create the lift needed to fly, a plane depends on a very fast-moving stream of air over the wings.
An airplane stall is when the lift over the wings is reduced to the point that the lift cannot support the weight of the aircraft in the air.
It's unusual for planes to stall at such a high altitude. Investigators hope the plane's second black box will reveal why that happened.
Cuando abrimos los registradores de vuelo,
When we opened the flight data recorder, even though it was really damaged, the conditions inside were good, and that was a huge relief.
y realmente fue un alivio encontrarlos en buen estado.
But for some reason, much of what's on the recorder is gibberish.
Unfortunately, some of the data was not usable. And it was some very important data points that were not available, such as elevator position, rudder position, heading, and the most important parameters, engine pressure ratios.
It's a disappointing loss for Sador.
We need those engine parameters.
The engine pressure numbers would tell investigators how much power the engines were generating. They would paint a picture of how the airplane was flying in its final minutes. In Washington, the NTSB offers to help. Sophisticated software may be able to recapture some of the lost data.
We wanted to work with what data we had to recover any engine data that we could.
Meanwhile, investigators look for other clues about what may have caused the stall.
That's quite a storm. Probably very heavy rain.
They discover that the plane flew through freezing, wet weather, capable of causing ice to form. Ice on the wings can cause a plane to stall.
When ice accumulates on an airplane, it will have increased drag and increased weight and decreased lift.
The MD-80 is equipped with an anti-icing system. When turned on, it blows hot air from the engines onto the wings, preventing ice from forming.
Let's see what they did about the ice.
Put on the fasten seatbelt sign. Man, that is a lot of nasty weather.
As the plane rose to 33,000 feet, Captain Ospina made an unusual decision.
Turn off engine anti-icing.
A short while later, First Officer Munoz wants to know if the anti-icing system should be put back on.
Did I turn it on, Captain?
Do we have ice?
Pilots generally examine the outside metal windowsill. to see whether ice is forming there.
Put him on.
It appears the captain saw ice. Since they were flying through cold and wet conditions, investigators don't know why the crew didn't simply turn on the anti-ice and leave it on.
Durante el vuelo,
With the weather conditions they had, they should have been using the anti-ice systems during the entire flight.
antihielo durante todo el vuelo.
Investigators wonder if the crew made an error that allowed ice to build up on the plane's wings, causing it to stall and fall from the sky. Promising new evidence in the crash of West Caribbean Flight 708 may help the investigative team to zero in on the cause of the disaster. The NTSB has managed to recover missing data about the MD-80's engines.
This was very important for us because it allowed us to understand the operation of the engine throughout the flight.
If there had been ice on the wings, the engines would have had to work harder to overcome the friction it creates. The engine power numbers would have gone up.
Look at this. Engine power wasn't going up, it was actually going down.
Therefore, that showed that there was no ice on the airframe.
Ice didn't cause the stall. So what did? Investigators must determine why the engines weren't providing the power needed to keep the MD-80 in the air. The airline's troubled history of safety violations gives investigators a possible lead. It had been cited for flying overweight planes.
Colombian authorities used to bring the aircraft to a scale they have at Bogota Airport and compare against the manifest, and in some occasions they found that the aircraft was heavier than what was reported.
Did Flight 708 stall in midair because it was too heavy?
During our visit to Panama, we observed that West Caribbean didn't have very rigorous control over the checking of passengers' luggage and their weight.
If a plane is too heavy, it may not be able to fly at higher altitudes where the air is less dense. Pilots need to make these calculations carefully.
Un piloto sabe a qué altitud puede volar, revisando o estudiando.
The pilot knows at what altitude he can fly by studying the aircraft's performance tables and inputting the plane's weight and the temperature.
La temperatura.
What investigators don't know is whether Captain Ospina did the maths correctly.
Stand by.
They now try to calculate whether Flight 708 was too heavy to avoid stalling at 33,000 feet.
So we went back and looked at the number of passengers on board, the number of crew on board, and the weight of the aircraft itself, along with the baggage.
They already tested the plane at its reported weight of 148,000 pounds.
All right, let's add a few thousand pounds. We got heavier luggage, misweighed cargo.
Let's try 155,000 pounds.
Investigators now make the calculations for a plane that's grossly overweight. They're in for a surprise.
And even with a heavier aircraft at takeoff, the aircraft could maintain level flight at 330.
It's a setback for the investigation.
We're missing something.
Let's go back to the beginning.
After much research, investigators still can't figure out what caused the plane to stall.
Thanks.
The answer has to do with how a plane distributes power. When it's turned on, the anti-icing system draws energy from the engines, reducing power for thrust.
this decrease in thrust can affect the performance of the airplane depending on the weight and the altitude. So the performance study showed that the airplane was perfectly safe to fly at 33,000 feet with the anti-ice off.
Anti-ice on, please.
However, it could only fly as high as 31,900 feet with the anti-ice on.
It was the anti-icing.
Robbed them of the power they needed.
They shouldn't have gone higher than 31.9.
La conclusión a que llega el equipo de investigación.
We concluded that the aircraft was flown too high for its weight and the weather conditions it faced.
Eso y las condiciones que tenía todo el vuelo.
Put them on.
The airspeed started to decelerate when the flight crew turned on the anti-ice system. This reduced the thrust of the engine.
Investigators conclude the reduction in thrust led the plane to stall.
Sir, we just got the final load sheet.
They now assume that when Captain Ospina calculated his maximum cruise altitude, he failed to factor in the need for anti-icing.
There are many factors they have to take into account when planning, and apparently they did not do it in this case.
But if low thrust led to a stall, why didn't the crew notice? Part of the answer is that while the problem was developing, they weren't flying the plane.
They had their autopilot on.
The autopilot should not let a plane stall. Investigators wonder why this particular autopilot let that happen. While researching the autopilot on the MD-80, they discover a bulletin from the plane's manufacturer. It was sent to the airline 3 years earlier.
Under some conditions, airspeed could decay to stall warning before the autopilot disconnects.
El boletín que emitió Boeing.
In the bulletin issued by Boeing, it described another incident with an autopilot that was almost the exact same as what had happened with West Caribbean.
Idéntica.
The bulletin warned crews that if they set the autopilot to maintain the plane's altitude, they should keep a close eye on their airspeed.
The operation bulletin warned that with the autopilot on and at altitude, that a similar situation could occur, where the aircraft could maintain altitude and airspeed could decrease if the pilots were not monitoring the airspeed.
So in order to maintain altitude, as the speed goes down, the aircraft starts to pitch up, nose up altitude, increasing the angle of attack to have a better lift. But that has a problem because you cannot exceed certain angle because you can enter stall condition.
In this case, the autopilot led the aircraft into a condition that caused an excessive angle of attack. That generated the stall.
As important as the bulletin was, there's no evidence that it ever reached West Caribbean's pilots. Investigators now have a deeper understanding of the events causing the stall. The crew were not monitoring their instruments, believing that the autopilot would maintain the correct speed. They were wrong. It was at this moment that the captain began to notice that something wasn't right.
I can't accelerate.
Don't go to the bathroom. That they were aware that they had a problem, but they didn't know why.
The captain decided to descend to an altitude where the engines would perform better.
310. And descending to 31,000 feet was the right choice. That's why he disconnected the autopilot to begin the descent.
Give me 310.
The plane is very close to stalling, but the crew is just a few seconds away from overcoming the problem.
If he would have attained 31,000 feet, during that descent, the speed would have gone up and he would have recovered the lift, and after leveling off, there will have been no problem at all.
They almost made it, but the captain was oblivious to his biggest threat. The plane is still traveling slowly, with its nose raised at a dangerously high angle. That's when the crew experienced some bad luck. The weather they were flying through was turbulent, winds were intense, and the plane was vulnerable.
Our study showed that it would only take a 20-mile-an-hour updraft to push the aircraft into a stall.
Investigators conclude that the plane was hit with a ferocious updraft that lifted the plane's nose just enough to put it into a stall. A crisis the crew then mishandled.
There was very little communication between them. The captain thought he was having a flameout in both engines.
Tell him we've had a flameout on both engines. We have a flameout on both our engines.
The captain was not telling the first officer what to do. The captain was only fixating, or if you will, have tunnel vision on the engines, which is a very big problem in this situation.
As the investigation into the crash of Flight 708 nears completion, only one mystery remains unsolved.
It's a stall!
Munoz seems to know what was happening.
Why did the crew fail to recover from a stall that they'd been trained to overcome?
To get out of a stall, a pilot should increase thrust and pitch over, that is, push forward on the control column.
But as the recovered flight data shows, that is not what Captain Ospina did.
There is no indication that the pilot pushed forward on the control column to reduce the angle of attack and to increase speed.
He's pulling back on the control column.
At that point, it was impossible to recover from the stall.
The captain should have pushed forward. The question remains, why didn't he? Investigators get their first clue when they re-examine the engine data at the precise moment of the stall.
That's what distracted the captain.
At the time that the airplane stalled, we also saw that both engines rolled back at the same time. This most likely confused the pilots.
When airflow to the engines is disrupted, it causes a rollback, reducing thrust.
Because of the updrafts that in the area, it most likely increased the angle of attack of the engine inlet, which then caused the engines rolled back.
With his engine power temporarily reduced, the captain wrongly concluded that his engines had quit.
It's a stall!
First officer yelled, "It's a stall, Cappy. It's a stall." There was no response from the captain. This showed that the captain was fixating most likely on the engines.
Unaware he had stalled, the captain made things worse by pulling back on his control column. That kept the nose of the plane angled dangerously high.
Tell him we've had a flameout on both engines. We've had a flameout on both engines.
La tripulación no supo
The crew couldn't understand the situation presented to them.
que se les presentó.
West 708, go down to level 240.
Do you have a problem on board?
We've had a flameout on both engines.
They had a heavy buffet from the stall. They were looking at the engines, which were rolled back, and they were also communicating with the air traffic controller. During that time, there was not much troubleshooting going on in the cockpit. This was a very, very difficult time for the pilots.
It is very important that the crews communicate in an effective way. And in this case, you don't hear the two pilots communicating between themselves.
Y no hubo comunicación efectiva entre ellos.
It was an almost silent cockpit until the time just before the accident, when they realized they were in deep trouble.
Del accidente, se dieron cuenta que estaban en graves problemas.
But by that time, it was already too late. They were past the point of no return.
During that descent, according to the flight data recorder, they reached a rate of descent, an average of more than 12,000 feet per minute. That rate of descent, not only the G-force will prevent them from any coordinated action, the vibration in the aircraft will be a lot. That's why when you hear the voice recorder, you hear the voice trembling.
Negative, negative. We are 14,000 feet. We're above 4,000. And going down. The plane is uncontrollable.
And that's because of high vibration in the aircraft.
For everyone on board, the final plunge was a nightmare, lasting almost 3 minutes.
Whiskey, Charlie, whiskey.
When Colonel Lawless Ramos and her team interview friends and family of the pilots of West Caribbean Flight 708,
How was he when he was at home?
they uncover other long-standing issues that may help explain the crew's behavior.
West Caribbean Airlines was going through a very critical financial status.
Esto debido a una situación económica que atravesaba la empresa West Caribbean.
Because of West Caribbean's economic struggles, the crew members hadn't been paid for 6 months.
Que tenían aproximadamente como 6 meses que no cobraban su.
And this could have influenced the captain's
De
concentration.
alguna otra manera influir en la concentración del capitán al momento de atender la emergencia.
Investigators discover that Captain Ospina was forced to take a second job, moonlighting in a bar, in order to make ends meet for his family.
Evidentemente, el nivel de estrés que
The level of stress that the captain was under because of his financial situation was huge.
es importante.
Have we solved the fuel situation yet?
I think we're getting close, Captain.
Before the accident, the crew was delayed in Colombia for hours because the airline couldn't pay for their fuel. That was their third of 4 flights that day.
La tripulación
The crew was under a lot of stress because they were already late and they didn't know if their flight would be canceled.
no se sabía si el vuelo se iba a cancelar.
It's a storm, Captain! It's a storm!
Investigators also believe that the 21-year-old first officer should have voiced his opinions more clearly.
Entre el capitán y el copiloto existía una
There was a considerable age difference between the captain and the co-pilot, and this might have intimidated the co-pilot when he needed to speak up.
dirigirse al capitán con autoridad.
Did I turn it on, Captain, or what?
Do we have ice?
No matter how young the co-pilots and the first officers are, how old and experienced the captain is, they have the right to preserve their life. If they see something that's going wrong,
It's a storm, Captain! It's a storm!
and they alert the captain, and he does not react, they should react by themselves.
The investigation's official report concludes that there was an insufficient level of situational awareness in both pilots.
Although the pilot's actions are in question in this flight, we also have to look at the operator. Did the operator provide proper training? We found that the training was insufficient, that they did not receive proper CRM training, and they did not receive proper stall training.
Este accidente ocurre por una cantidad de factores que no son
This accident happened as a result of numerous factors that aren't only attributable to the crew.
en el funcionamiento de
There were deplorable conditions in the operation of the airline.
estas son
And over time, these faults can lead to accidents.
y que en el transcurso del tiempo van afectando negativamente todo el funcionamiento de la empresa.
Negative, negative! We're at 14,000 feet! We've had to climb out both engines!
The report makes a long list of recommendations to ensure that the tragedy of Flight 708 never happens again.
Se hizo recomendaciones de seguridad a la Autoridad Aeronáutica Colombiana.
We made recommendations to the Colombian aviation authorities to improve pilot training, specifically better training in crew communication and having a better awareness about the use of the plane's autopilot.
Del uso del piloto automático en las aeronaves MD.
After this accident occurred, the airline was grounded and it never operated again. It went bankrupt and simply disappeared.
But West Caribbean Airways did leave a valuable legacy. Better safety measures for every other MD-80 taking to the skies today.